Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Recently we checked out a couple of quirky Android-powered cameras, including the Lite L16, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to also do a revisited look back at the Hasselblad True Zoom camera mod. This is another kind of strange camera, born out of a collaboration between the Swedish camera company and Motorola via their experimental Moto Z series of modular phones that you could attach various mods magnetically to add additional functionality. And this mod's claim to fame is offering 10 times continuous optical zoom, a feat which is still pretty rare to this day, unless you're looking at past devices from Samsung under their Galaxy camera or the S4 zoom line. But one benefit that the Hasselblad offered is that modularity. You could easily detach it from the phone if you're not really using it and carry something less heavy. Granted, this thing was met with pretty lukewarm reception when it was released, despite the Hasselblad name typically representing higher quality cameras, which are usually very expensive, becoming one of the first cameras to be taken into space, and represented a legacy of excellent camera hardware. Unfortunately, the True Zoom was just a little shy of that, namely with the sensor size. This thing has a 1/2.3-inch sensor, which is actually not larger than the one already found on the Moto Z phone. And although a little bit of a generalization, when we have larger camera sensors, it typically allows you to let in more light, resulting in photos which have more natural bokeh and impressive DSLR-like effects, versus this one still is a pretty typical sensor which is found in a lot of compact point-and-shoots. However, the optical zoom was one true benefit, that is, allowing you to get much closer to subjects which are further away and dynamically zoom in and out, which on newer devices from Samsung, for instance, there are going to be telephoto zoom lenses, but those are not really continuous zoom. It's more like a magnifying lens where you can choose between 0 times and then go all the way up to 10 times, but you can't really go into, say, 8.5 times that a true continuous zoom system like this will, as the lens will physically move in and out. One other benefit is the flash. It's using a Xenon flash, which is much more powerful than a conventional LED flash found on smartphones, typically illuminate objects better in the dark without any computational processing through algorithms, for instance. In terms of the build quality, this thing was decent. It has a aluminum alloy kind of lens component, as well as the side here that says Hasselblad, although the grip section here, which feels pretty ergonomic, as well as the other half, are constructed out of a soft touch rubber material, but still is elegant enough. The retail price of the True Zoom, by the way, was around $250, so it was never super expensive, but comparable to some lower end point and shoots, since it's only compatible with Motorola's Z smartphones, and those phones are more or less discontinued. You can now find this camera for around $40, sometimes even less when shopping around. That also makes it a lot more cost effective. Of course, the lens at the end of the day will protrude outwards, but at the same time, it's not too bad since there isn't additional bulk taken up by extra hardware. For instance, the battery and the screen are both being used on the phone, so we end up with a slice of the camera. Otherwise, we had access to a pretty traditional continuous zoom, as well as a 2-stage camera shutter key, press in halfway to focus and then all the way down to capture the shot. There's also a power key that you could tap on to instantly launch into the camera UI once you have it connected to the phone, using those magnetic pogo contacts that snaps into place quite well. One feature that is missing though, compared to a conventional camera, would be a standard tripod mount. So you had to still use something like a smartphone tripod if you wanted to position this to capture, let's say, a time-lapse footage or rest it just on a table. Last but not least, the back here just stated Hasselblad 1941 to 2016, celebrating 75 years of inspiring creativity. Now, of course, despite the fact that the Hasselblad True Zoom wasn't the most successful product for the company, they didn't really give up on the smartphone collaboration market. And in more modern times, they have teamed up with Oppo, which is why we see that branding on a lot of their phones, as well as OnePlus devices, starting with the 9 Pro, supposedly improving on areas like color science through some of the Hasselblad filters, as well as optimization work they've done on the software, although the hardware of that thing was not actually manufactured by Hasselblad. Now, last but not least, before we take a closer look at the performance and the UI, here's just a quick final peek at the specs. So again, compatible with any Moto Z phone. The weight at 145 grams on its own is pretty light, but keep in mind there is no battery inside, so you have to attach it to the phone to begin shooting. And otherwise, it does have two microphones as well for video recording up to 1080p Full HD, but only 30 frames per second. And one unfortunate downside is as you are zooming in and out, the microphones at the bottom here have a tendency to also pick up some of the motor noises. So it's not the best video shooter in the world, primarily just for capturing photos. Here with an aperture range of f3.5 to 6.5 as you're moving between the 1 versus 10 times zoom. And it does have optical image stabilization, like most dedicated cameras at least, so it will prevent itself from getting too fuzzy even if you are doing a little bit of micro shaking, but of course you still have to be reasonably still. And last but not least, maybe one benefit of this device is it does shoot in RAW using its companion app. So you are able to further export this into Photoshop, for instance, and edit it in a more granular way versus many default Android phones will only shoot in JPEG, for instance, which is not quite as easy to edit afterwards. Everything else, though, in terms of sensors like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, of course, it just borrows from the phone. And one benefit, like any other Android-powered camera, is it's a lot easier to export and share directly. So from the hardware perspective, I think at least it looks quite good, and it's a very tight connection, never wobbles or feels loose at all. Moving into performance, the phone again automatically recognizes when the mod is attached, and we can then just click on the power key there once, and it will jump into the Hasselblad version of the camera software. The large display on the Android smartphone then serves as an excellent viewfinder. From here, we can tap on the Hasselblad icon to choose between JPEG versus RAW capture modes, as well as auto scene, in which you can also go into custom, sports, prioritizing shutter speed, as well as a night portrait and a night landscape modes as well. It will increase the exposure time to let in more light, although the computational photography algorithms are nowhere as advanced as something like a Pixel, so the results are still not going to be quite as strong when the light starts getting low, especially when combined with the sensor size, which is still pretty typical for a smartphone. You're not getting anything magical like you would on a 1-inch sensor, for instance. But nonetheless, you can play around with some of these modes, and otherwise we can toggle other settings like the Xenon flash, the timer, as well as under the three dots here, you can choose between recording video, capturing panorama just by tilting the phone around when you are shooting, and also a pro mode. Focus range you can set into infinity, as well as manually slide up and down, as you can see there, which is actually quite cool. And in terms of the camera lens, at the very least, it doesn't require you to be too far away from an object. Simply 3 or 4 inches and you're good to go. So you can also use the optical zoom and be able to capture some macro shots if you really wanted to. You can also play around with ISO, white balance, all those details up above. Kind of is reminiscent of something like a Nokia Lumia interface from back in the day. Contrast levels can also be manually adjusted by tapping on a region and then using this dial to swipe up and down to make it brighter versus dimmer. This gives you an idea of what the 10x optical zoom looks like, and still pretty quick to capture at the very least. You can instantly delete. You can also go past 10 times, all the way up to 40 times magnification if you're using further digital zoom. So this will of course no longer look quite as sharp, but it gets you a very wide zoom range that gets much closer to an object than you would otherwise even dream of getting. And again, every point in between until you hit 10 times zoom still looks sharp. Another thing to keep in mind is because it is using your phone's battery, the optical zoom and extra hardware sensors will drain power more quickly. If you're also expecting to use your phone for, let's say, content consumption and playing back games, and you use the zoom lens, it's probably going to drain itself in about a day or half a day. So having a built-in cell of its own would have probably been a smarter decision, at least to prolong the battery life, though that would have made the entire experience more bulky and heavy. Although yes, you can also plug in a Type-C port and charge it while using it at the same time. It's just not quite as elegant. Plus the phone does get a little bit warm on the section here towards the grip after you're shooting it in the viewfinder mode for more than 20 minutes. And to preserve on power, when you go into the album view, the camera will automatically retract and protect the lens from damage as well. So at 12 megapixels, you're not getting more resolution compared to the default camera built onto the phone. So this is not going to be suitable for purposes like billboards and advertisements that you want to blow up, but on a phone screen or even a computer screen, it still looks reasonable, I would say, and keeps the file sizes at a decent amount. Again, this is an example of a faraway shot that we were able to capture using the zoom lens, something that wouldn't be possible with the phone's camera by default without scaring away the animals here. That 10x optical zoom also keeps things relatively sharp as long as you aren't overly shaky. Some final shots here of buildings and tiny details further away. It's also an area where having this camera, this zoom lens in particular, definitely shines. Is it the best in the world in terms of sharpness as well as color science? Not really, but of course it still is, I think, good enough for the purposes intended here. The skies are a little bit overcast and auto HDR algorithms aren't really present, but you can always play around with contrast manually if you are exporting it in RAW and further do some editing if desired. And in terms of usability, again, it's not bad. Popping it on and waking up the camera really just takes a split second. It's not too slow, and same thing goes with capturing images. It's not overly unresponsive either, so at least you're not waiting too long. Again, don't expect miracles when it comes to this really rivaling the level of bokeh from a DSLR with much larger sensors. I think maybe that was what the expectation was when first this thing was announced because of the Hasselblad brand. But again, as far as a mobile photography tool, something to just capture your memories when you are on the go and getting you that zoom range, I think it's actually still quite competent. Here's also an example of 1x versus the 10x zoom, getting all the way close into the power line here and still retaining plenty of sharpness. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited look back at the Hasselblad True Zoom. I would say, again, this is a product that doesn't really blow you away per se when it comes to the raw photographic capabilities, but it's still a pretty versatile and fun tool. In fact, I would dare say one of the more interesting and perhaps practical mods that were released for the Moto Z line. So thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. You can learn more details about this, as well as some throwback looks at the Moto Z phones themselves if interested on this channel. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews.